Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar mini-conference, Negotiating Islamic Selfhood, Romance and Censorship in Middle Eastern and South Asian Cinema. I'm Eben Graves from the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and I help oversee our Fellows program here, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual event. As you might know, each year the ISM welcomes a cohort of interdisciplinary scholars to the Institute for a year of research, teaching, and interdisciplinary work at the nexus of sacred music, worship, and the related arts. In addition to these core activities, we invite our fellows to organize a conference, a concert, or another type of event that is closely tied with the research that they are carrying out during their fellowship year. Today's webinar conference is a result of one such invitation. And we are very pleased that Dr. Heba Abdelfattah has organized this online conference and invited such a stellar roster of speakers. Our thanks go to her and the other co-sponsors for this event, the Department of Religious Studies here at Yale and the Yale Macmillan Center's Council on Middle East Studies and the South Asian Studies Council. Before introducing Abdelfattah, let me point out a link in the chat that I'm going to put there right now. There it is. And this link will bring you to the event page for today's conference, where you can find the schedule of speakers and also some bios for our different presenters. You'll notice on the schedule we have a short break in the middle of the conference, and we'll also have a question and answer session at the end. But in the meantime, at any point during the conference, you can add any questions you have for any of the speakers by clicking on the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And when the question and answer session comes, we'll get to as many questions as we can. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the organizer for today's conference and the first speaker in our schedule, Dr. Heba Arafa Abdelfattah. So a bit about her. After receiving a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Georgetown University in 2017, Dr. Abdelfattah was a visiting assistant professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Georgia Institute of Technology. She comes to Yale from London, where she has been a research fellow at the Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. She is currently completing a book manuscript on film, Islam, and modernity in colonial Egypt. At Yale, her project centers on the study of the Arabic genre of Islamic hymns as an exemplar of a popular cultural approach to study Islam as a lived experience based on the inclusion and not the elimination of difference. So with that, I introduce Dr. Abdelfattah, who is there and is going to share her slides as well. So welcome.
I start by thanking our audience for their interest, my fellow presenters, Yale Institute of Sacred Music, Dr. Eben Graves, and our ISM staff for choosing time to make this event happen. Today, I share a presentation from a broader book project on film, modernity, and Islamic colonial Egypt, particularly in between two revolutions, 1919 and 1952. So without further ado, I will share my slides. So a quick glance at Egyptian classics can conclude that modernity in Egypt emerged as a predominantly secular domain that is anti-religion. But a closer look at screen tools, especially the dialogue, reveals that Islam served as a substratum of the everyday life practices of film characters. This view of Egyptian cinema cannot be grasped by studying cinema as a mass culture of nationalism or commercial culture. Instead, I suggest reading early Egyptian classics as a public culture, that's to say a zone of culture debate about discourses of modernity, as creative imagination, namely the capacity of cinemas art to find and organize new descriptions of experiences that push boundaries towards a social change rooted in a civic identity shaped by the long revolutionary quest for social justice. In so doing, Egyptian film classics can offer us a new insight into how people living in the first half of 20th century Egypt might have experienced or engaged with questions of modernity. Indeed, much research has been done on the question of modernity. The research which attempts to define modernity seems to adopt two primary approaches. On the one hand, modernity is conceptualized as a process of societal modernization that emerged in and outside the West, accompanied by a set of liberal values regulated by the state's acknowledgement of the entitlement of the laity as citizens to participate in the affairs of the state, with the main goal of improving the human condition. Alternatively, modernity is studied as a colonialist discourse that leads to the accumulation of wealth and power in the West, thereby causing displacement and further deterioration in the human condition. Post-colonial nation states, we are told, continue to adopt forms of knowledge produced in colonial times and continue thus to suffer from incomplete or failed projects of modernity. Egyptian film classics, however, speak neither of a singular modernity that defines all other histories in its terms, nor of the easy pluralism of alternative modernities, or even the restaging of European modernity. Indeed, Egyptian pioneer filmmakers acknowledge imperialism as the most powerful expression of universal modernity, which is steered by a crony capitalist project of modernization that survives by displacing, subordinating, and marginalizing all elements that appear incompatible with colonialist modernity, Western or capitalist. However, the understanding of modernity presented in many of these early films break with the polarization of modernity inside the West versus alternative modernities outside the West. Instead, early films posed the possibility of understanding modernity as a structure of feeling in any geographical setting, thereby marking a sharp distinction between consciousness and false consciousness of modernity. As a structure of feeling, modernity materializes in the public sphere as emergent, dominant, and residual cultures. Egyptian film classics depict the last two as false consciousness of modernity that survives on marginalization and exclusion. The emergent, which is constantly in conflict with both the dominant and the residual, invariably seeks to negotiate global coexistence rooted in social justice and freedom of conscience. However, the understanding of modernity presented in many of these early films breaks with the polarization of modernity inside the West versus modernity outside the West. Sorry, I skipped. So one example that I share with you today is Yusuf Wahbi's 1949 film, Bayoumi Effendi. So who is Yusuf Wahbi? Yusuf Wahbi was a university. He's an Egyptian director. As Egyptian director Hassan al-Imam once described him, he combined acting, writing, direction, production, management, and ownership of assets in the fields of both theater and cinema. He mastered composing music, performing comedic monologues, film editing, dabbling in set decoration and publicity. Considering his rich personal life, including 3 marriages, numerous affairs, and tangled relationship with prominent figures of his era in the field of politics, art, and literature, the title "I Lived for 1,000 Years" is an understandable choice of his multi-volume memoir published in 1973. Born in 1898 to an aristocratic father who was a chief irrigation inspector and an active member of the famous anti-colonialist liberal Wafd party, Wahbi's family opposed his desire to become an actor. The father wanted his son to be a doctor or an engineer and thus withdrew all financial support. While Wahbi succeeds in finding his passion outside the walls of the palace and its Korean bourgeois rigid norms, one question, however, persisted all through Wahbi's life. How could Wahbi's father claim to be a supporter of an independent modern Egypt and oppose the idea of having an Egyptian theater and film industry? In the aftermath of the 1919 anti-British Revolution, Wahbi traveled to Italy to study theater through the famous Conservatoire di Milan and to also study what was by then the nascent art of cinema. In 1922, Wahbi returned to Egypt, determined to set up a theater company, which he called Ramses Company, which began its performance on March 10, 1923, and remained the most famous and most influential Arabic theater movement by performing more than 300 plays, both translated and adapted or originally written in Arabic. Ramses Company was a generating force behind talents of hundreds of actors and actresses in Egypt. In 1926, Wahbi faced a crisis that could have blown apart his artistic career when a German film company cast him in the role of the Prophet Muhammad. He came in for the majority of the criticism by the famous institution of Islamic theology, Al-Azhar, the Royal Palace, and brutal media campaign that accused him of being a renegade, one step away from being an unbeliever. So King Fuad of Egypt threatened to banish Wahbi and revoke his citizenship if he were to carry out his plans. While Wahbi saw the film as a lost opportunity for Muslims to represent the religion themselves, he saw censorship as a byproduct of a deeper Islamic discourse on the adaptability of Islamic theological and legal tradition to meet new and changing social conditions. This controversy did not cease until Wahbi announced that he would turn down the offer to star in the film. Wahbi made his film production debut in Zainab, an adaptation of what's often labeled as the first Arabic novel written by Hakel. Directed by his lifelong friend Muhammad Karim, Zainab is often credited with being the first silent, not the first silent, but the first silent to present the Egyptian countryside on the screen. Wahbi is credited with bringing sound to film in Egypt, with his film Sons of the Aristocrats or Sons of the Noble, directed by Muhammad Karim, which Wahbi produced and was his acting debut. In the 1940s, he entered a partnership with the Nihas brothers with the aim of founding the Nihas Studio, one of Egypt's most important studios. While his output as an actor comprised 1927 films, his output as a director comprised at least 30 films. Wahbi received recognition and appreciation in various forms. In 1944, King Farouk conferred him the title Bey, perhaps an equivalent of the English title Sir, after the monarch watched his film Passion and Revenge. He received the first class of Order of Merit in 1960, a State Appreciation Award in 1970, and an honorary doctorate degree in arts in 1975. He was appointed director of the National Theater many times. The Vatican awarded Wahbi the Golden Medal for his role as Cardinal Giovanni in his famous play, The Confession Seat, which he filmed in 49. So Wahbi's films Bayoumi Effendi is written, directed, and acted by Yusuf Wahbi. It's adapted from the play, which carries the same title. It follows the story of Bayoumi Mustafa, a middle-aged Korean man who owns a small kiosk for fixing watches and clocks in a densely populated Korean neighborhood. He's known for his efficiency, hard work, and empathy. He doesn't overcharge his customers and sometimes fixes their clock for free. Bayoumi runs his business without receipts or checks. He relies on integrity and word of mouth. People call him Effendi, as he doesn't dress in a galabiya, the traditional Egyptian dress for men, and because he is literate, as opposed to being illiterate, but he favors the title efficient craftsman, Usta. Now, Bayoumi likes his neighbor Zubayda, a housemaid who refuses his repeated marriage proposals because his income is below her social ambitions. Bayoumi's business is crushed under the big business of Hernan. The latter does not hire locals. He discriminates against his customers and favors only Egyptians of European ancestry. Bayoumi's finances improve when he meets another watchmaker, Monsieur Gerard, whose hand watch, a zone brand that he has worked hard to develop, stopped working when he arrived in Egypt. Of course, he meets Bayoumi and Bayoumi fixes his watch. So it's imperative here to explain what Wahbi employs, that Wahbi employs the character of Bayoumi to make a clear distinction between Khawaja Gerard and Khawaja capital A Hernan by calling the first our Khawaja, Khawagitna, implying that Gerard represents the idea of a fair share economy. Gerard's business, adventure, and investment is not driven by greed and colonial superiority like Hernan's. It is driven by a passion for partnership, growing the local economy, creating job opportunities for locals, and allowing people like Bayoumi to create a name for themselves. The partnership between Gerard and Bayoumi resulted in taking over Hernan's business, opening a factory, and creating more job opportunities for locals. When Bayoumi becomes rich, he marries Zubayda, who finds in this marriage an opportunity to cover up for her pregnancy after having an affair with her ex-employer, Shaukat Bey. And then Zubayda gives birth to 2 children. The eldest is Nabil and the youngest is Zinat. Bayoumi's life takes a short turn when Shaukat Bey decides to repent on his deathbed. He invites Bayoumi to tell him the news that Nabil is not Bayoumi's son. Shocked and devastated, Bayoumi has to make the difficult choice between breaking up and losing his daughter or living with his family without mentioning anything to his wife. So choosing forgiveness, Bayoumi raises the 2 children equally. Meanwhile, Bayoumi's daughter Zinat, which is his daughter, falls in love with a young doctor by the name of Kamal, whose siblings file a paternity case against him to deprive him of his inheritance. Nabil and his mother oppose Zinat's marriage plans, while Bayoumi stands with the young couple and supports them. Now, when Bayoumi fails to persuade his son that Kemal should not be blamed for his parents' choices, Bayoumi faces Nabil with the fact that he's exactly in the same position as Kemal, that's to say, born out of wedlock. Like many Egyptian films at the time, Bayoumi Effendi has a happy ending. The film ends with Kemal and Zinad getting married. But what is this film really about beyond its happy ending? Well, Bayoumi Effendi is a film that presents an explicit and harsh critique of dominant modernity, which I signify here with the Arabic word tafarnuq. Tafarnuq neither echoes the word Afrangi, which is a foreigner of European origin, especially of French defense, that refers to the word Franks, nor does it signify blind imitation of Western social practices. Blind imitation is in fact an achievement if compared to tafarnuq. So tafarnuq instead refers to the social practice of cultivating an amour propre, that's to say self-presentation aimed at cultivating a certain style of being in the eyes of others, of a modern civilizational form, الشكل الحضاري العصري. This is done by means of imposing European and later American everyday life practices in local dining habits, dress codes, and house decor, workplaces, leisure time activities, without the internalization of modern notions of equity and social justice. For Wahhabi's 1940s Korean bourgeois, tafarnuq is both an end and a mean. Its purpose is not to mimic to learn, but to simply claim superiority and exercise patronization to regulate attempts to imagine the modern and reinterpret the past, only to sustain tafarnuq as a dominant culture of modernity. Tafarnuq thus is an amour propre and a discourse of modernity. Sorry, it's a delusive amour propre and a discourse of modernity. So both Nabil and his mother adhere to tafarnuq. They both are ashamed of Bayoumi for not being as modern as they expect him to be. In one scene, Zubaydah criticizes Bayoumi for oiling the clocks around the house. She says, "Man, are you ever going to learn how to become modern? Send some worker from your factory to fix it." To Zubaydah, being modern means embracing tafarnuq as a supremacist ideology. Likewise, Zubaydah doesn't want Bayoumi to call himself a watchman, Sa'ati. Instead, she wants him to call himself a jewelry seller. That's gawahirgi in Egyptian. She bans cooking, the popular Egyptian dish, which is bisara, which Bayoumi likes, and imposes instead a French food menu. Wahhabi's dialogue choices constantly condemn tafarnuq all through the film. For example, Bayoumi resents the title jewelry seller and says, "I'm a watchman, I'm not a jewelry seller. It is like someone is a cart driver, arbagi, and they call him a chauffeur. It's driving in the end." When his wife insists that he wears a collar for his shirt, Bayoumi questions why his wife insists that he looks like a mannequin in a department store. Here, Wahbi lampoons how tafarnuq regulates its subjects' amour propre and turns them into stages for colonialist modernity instead of them staging their own understanding of modernity. Now, a more explicit condemnation of tafarnuq appears when Bayoumi tells his wife, "Can't we imitate Europeans in things better than shirt collars that or which look like a dog collar?" That's a typo, I'm sorry. Bayoumi further comments that the collar should be cancelled. Along with the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, it's a statement that clearly sees tafarnuq as a byproduct of colonialist modernity, enforced by the reality of British occupation, which was hoped to end with the unilateral abrogation of the treaty, a political decision that started in 1947 and materialized in 1951. Metaphors representing Islam are on the margin of film characters adhering to tafarnuq. They are almost non-existent in scenes dedicated to Bayoumi's wife and son, and if they exist, they are appropriated to serve the accumulation of power and wealth within patriarchal social order. On the other hand, emergent modernity, which I refer to here using the Arabic word asala, is a host domain for metaphors representing Islam. Asala is a structure of feeling, a positive, that's to say an active, equitative alternative to tafarnuq. It's a dynamic and practical consciousness, a voluntary choice to relate to contemporary reality by contesting the correlation between becoming modern and the imposition of European and later American everyday life practices in dining, in local dining, work, and leisure habits. Here, Asala doesn't emerge as a stance against the foreign. It's a stance against the claims of superiority of the foreign. It questions the idealization of the Khawagas social practice while simultaneously stigmatizing local social practices as vulgar, backward, primitive, and incompatible with modernity. Filmmakers often tie the character's attitude of Asala to its vulnerability, which was not depicted as a sign of character's weakness. Rather, a character's vulnerability was depicted as a sign of courage that enabled the character to overcome a myth of shame associated with breaking a dominant social norm. Both Bayoumi and Zinat stand as his daughters in it stand as a metaphor of asala, not only by condemning tafarnuq, but also by underscoring inclusion and social justice as core values of modernity. This is very evident in the position from Zinat's fiancé and the paternity case. To Bayoumi, what matters is man's ability to be self-made. He repeats the Arabic saying that thou shalt not make a name for thyself by relying on the deeds of your ancestors. Let thy deeds make thy name. He tells Kamal that by becoming a doctor, whose job is to heal mankind, eliminate pain, and save lives, Kamal has fulfilled this condition and is thus worthy of marrying Bayoumi's daughter. Wahbi further constructs inclusion by employing Quranic notion of afu, forgiveness, as a catalyst for social change. For example, when Wahbi discovers his wife's betrayal, he rushes to his villa and goes straight to the room of the alleged child Nabil. In a status of mental shock, Bayoumi holds the baby boy to throw him out of the balcony. The next scene shows the shadow of Bayoumi's spiritual guide, Sheikh Darwish, who serves as an externalization of Bayoumi's conscience to remind him that as a believer, he should beware of God and not commit an injustice, for the child is innocent. Sheikh Darwish then reminds Bayoumi of the Quranic maxim that reads, none shall bear the burden of another, which appears in many Quranic verses. This maxim motivates Bayoumi to choose to pardon. This choice is asserted again in a later scene showing Bayoumi reading verse Q 2570, save for those who repent and believe and perform righteous deeds, for them God will replace their evil deeds with good deeds, and God is forgiving, merciful. Inclusion is further constructed in this film through the correlation between dominant modernity, tafarnuq, and the Quranic notion of kufr, which is commonly translated as disbelief, but here Wahbi foregrounds its interpretation as ingratitude. In one scene, for example, Bayoumi enters his daughter's room while holding an incense in his and reading Quran to drive away envy. His son, of course, makes fun of him and calls him he's a joke. Then Bayoumi responds by reading the Quranic verse 2:6, which usually translate as, truly it is the same for the unbeliever, whether thou warnest them or warnest them not, they don't believe. When Wahbi uses this verse to comment on his son's attitude, he is not referring to his son as an un-Muslim or unbeliever. Rather, he signifies Nabil's tafarnuq, which makes him supremacist, arrogant, egoistic, and constantly ungrateful. After all, Bayoumi didn't have to raise Nabil up. Martin Waldman's classic study on the development of the concept of kufr in the Quran sheds a lot of light on the shifting meaning of the Arabic word kufr by tracing how between the first Meccan period and the end of Revelation, that's to say the end of the Quran, the meaning of kufr gradually moves away from ingratitude and comes closer to disbelief and unbelief. During the first and the second Meccan period, this aspect of kufr as ingratitude is sharpened by the frequent presence of the root used as its opposite, that's to give thanks, shukr, or to be grateful. It is not by committing major sin, but by denying God's blessing and refusing to be grateful and believing in one's own self-sufficiency that a human becomes a kafir. Wahbi's correlation between dominant modernity, tafarnuq, and his reinterpretation of kufr as ingratitude is further emphasized in a dialogue between Zinat and her sister-in-law, who adheres to tafarnuq and urges Zinat to break her engagement because of her fiancé's scandal. Zinat responds, obviously, there is a huge difference between arrogance and humbleness, between mercy and evil. She then reads the Quranic verse, may man perish, how ungrateful is he. قُتِلَ الْإِنسَانُ مَا أَكْفَرَهُ. Again, kufr here is interpreted as ingratitude. Zinat's perception of herself as a modern woman is rooted in her ability to share social responsibility with her partner, thereby standing up for her choices. She tells her mother, I am educated enough to understand that a woman can and must share her partner's pains. Zinat does not admire Kamal for his wealth and his British education, but for his ability to overcome the social stigma caused by the paternity case. Yusuf Wahbi's repeated references to Islamic sources in his film Bayoumi Effendi should not be mistaken for an interest in promoting an Islamist agenda in the more contemporary usage of the word Islamist today. To him and his generation of filmmakers, the screen functioned as a supplemental secular public sphere that can accentuate the crucial difference between Islam as a faith, Islam as an ideology, and Islam as a man-made body of legal knowledge that has the vital semantic potentials to be translated into secular idioms and in a universally accessible language. while Wahbi simply calls attention to the importance of decoding ethical intuitions of religious traditions, which could be incorporated into a post-secular stance that finds and aligns religious sources of meaning in challenging the forces of colonialist projects of domination, here being colonialist modernity. More importantly, his films, including Bayoumi Effendi, show that such a task falls not only to experts, here being the ulama or theologians and religious citizens, but to all citizens, both religious and secular, who wish to engage in the public use of reason. Wahbi and his generation of filmmakers are perhaps what Charles Taylor describes as Islam's internal critics. Their films were attempts to create a space for religion to exist in predominantly secular efforts of modernization, while simultaneously safeguarding the screen as a secular domain that aims primarily at revealing the ideology of the powerful, here being the Korean bourgeois class and its dominant exclusionist modernity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdelfattah, for that fascinating talk. The first of today that I'm sure is going to start to uncover a fascinating mosaic here we find in film across the Middle East and South Asia. So we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule. I think that's mostly because I didn't take up my full 10 minutes, but you were right on time. So with that, we're going to.
I should have slowed down. I'm sorry.
No, it was fascinating. It was perfect. So thank you very much. With that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who will come on the screen here momentarily. There, hello. Our next speaker, we're pleased to introduce, is Najwa Abdallah, currently a PhD candidate in cultural studies in the Department of Communications and New Media at National University of Singapore. She holds an MA in Critical Media and Cultural Studies from SOAS, University of London, and a BA in English Literature from the Universitas Indonesia. Her research interests include history of communications, popular culture, critical theory, and post-colonial thought. Her PhD research focuses on the technological and meaning-making processes transpiring in contemporary Islamic cinema in Indonesia. Previously, she has published in the Journal of Political and Religious Practices and Journal of Islamic and Muslim Studies. And her talk for today is titled Rediscovery of Religious Selfhood and its Cinematic Articulation in Indonesia. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Najwa Abdallah. And with that, you can share your screen when you're ready.
All right, thank you so much, Eben, for the kind introduction. I'd like to first thank Eben and Heba, especially for organizing this wonderful panel, and of course for the rest of the organizers from Yale University that I cannot mention in here. So let me share my screen. My presentation today is on a rediscovery of religious selfhood and its cinematic articulation in Indonesia. It is actually a part of ongoing research for a chapter in my dissertation, where I will specifically talk about the influence of the discourse of hijrah, which is interpreted as religious shift or self-reform in the construction of Muslim youth in Islamic-themed melodrama films in Indonesia. For today's presentation, I'd like to offer a contextual reading of one of the films titled 100% Halal to show how hijrah is imagined in the popular cinematic discourse. For this, I will first explain the social and economic context that give rise to the popularity of hijrah, especially among the urban-based middle-class Muslim youth in the region. Then I will continue with the film summary and juxtapose it vis-a-vis the historical context of religious revivalism and Islamic representation in Indonesian cinema. Then I will explain in further details the characteristics of the new religious selfhood portrayed in the Islamic melodrama film genre, and end with a few remarks for possible theoretical explorations. So over the years, Indonesian Muslim youth are seen to follow a distinct trajectory in dealing with opportunities and challenges offered by the modern world. They are becoming more inclined towards deepening their religious knowledge and adopting a more Islam-compliant lifestyle, which is generally understood as hijrah. So such a shift towards a more religious way of life is generally popularized as hijrah. So of note here is that beyond this context, hijrah is originally an Arabic word for migration, which later denotes a major turning point in Islamic history, where the Prophet Muhammad moves from Mecca to Medina to seek refuge. However, the practice of hijrah that I highlight in my presentation here is very different from the historical meaning, although many of its advocates do use this historical account as a departure point of conversation. In this sense, the idea of hijrah in contemporary Indonesian context does signify a transition from one phase to another, from a sinful, spiritually deprived life to a more pious and spiritually rewarding one that identifies more with Islam. Now, in that context, for those who commit to hijrah, such a shift typically affects various areas of life, including media and cultural consumption habits, professional pursuits, and even dressing habit. As quoted by a scholar here, hijrah often connotes a shift from looseness to strictness, particularly in the sense that piety should be appeared in outward form. These entail, for example, faithful consumptions using mostly halal products and services, wearing veils and loose clothing for women, or growing beard and wearing ankle-length pants for men. And as I shall show in the discussion of the chosen film, avoidance of interaction between the sexes and thus modern dating. As such, there is a distinctively spectacular element in the rhetoric of hijrah, whereby religiosity should be made visible or follows a series of concrete actions. In the last decade, thanks to its wide circulation among celebrities, as well as professional and educational circles, hijrah has grown into a popular cultural trend whereby young Indonesian Muslims creatively share their thoughts and experiences on hijrah through music, popular writing, social media postings, and films, thereby portraying the transition to a visibly pious lifestyle as a moral urgency in a modernizing, secularizing world. So I hope the pictures here illustrate the diversity of popular culture items that circulate in this regard. So this new generation of hijrah Muslims, for just a link with a strong articulation, the rise of Mipsters or Muslim hipsters or Generation M, who are basically new generations of Muslims who, growing up with consumerism and post 9/11 identity politics, display a heightened awareness of religious identity and seek to instill Islamic values into various aspects of their modern life, including fashion, food, travel, music, and the like. The most common aspect of the two experiences between the local articulations of religious revivalism and the global context is best described through Jan Muhammad's term halalification that explains how such pursuit results in a complicated series of decisions about halal acts in navigating the modern world, in which issues related to romantic pursuit and companionship are highlighted in the Indonesian case. An important film that captures these issues vividly is Hijrah Cinta, or Love Migration, which is essentially a biopic of the late Islamic preacher cum pop star Jeffrey Al-Bukhari, popularly known as UJ, who managed to hijrah from indulgence in hedonistic lifestyle to a more spiritually rewarding path with support from his wife Pipik. A scholar here views the film as the blending of his film fantasy with real-world piety, which uses Uj's transformation story from a struggling soap opera actor into a successful terror preacher to conceive piety as not only a path to redemption, but realizes a new self with career, success, finding love, and forming a family, and therefore brings stability, certainty, and reward. With such trope of twinning love and piety as a foundation of success, films of this type reframe piety as aspirational choice, which is not only redemptive, but also attracts material rewards. Such idea of aspirational piety here is a new trait that deserves further scrutiny in this presentation. The film 100% Halal is a Muslim-oriented melodrama that is neither a biopic nor in any way based on a real story of a religious figure. It does, however, follow similar propositions of the spiritual and worldly benefits of a religiously inspired love, with a highlight on controversial issue of marrying young, which recently becomes a popular topic. Broadly speaking, the film is quite conflicting. It adopts a positive view on young marriages, while also attempting to provide a critique on normative ideas around religion, especially those propelled by self-proclaimed religious experts on television, especially. As the narrative threads are built on quotidian concerns such as familial and romantic relationships, and thus put emotionality at the forefront, 100% Halal shares many thematic and stylistic similarities to sinetron, or Indonesian version of soap opera, including in terms of quality of productions and acting. Because of such proximity with sinetron, 100% Halal and many other films of similar concerns validate traditional practices of feminine socialization and suggest that feminine identification gives women the ability equal to physical prowess, wealth, and so on to shape and alter the course of people's life. So against such a backdrop, 100% Halal follow a story of a father-daughter conflicts. It revolves around a high school student aged 18, who is a daughter of an Islamic motivational speaker. Her name is Ninis, who agrees to an arranged marriage following her father's advice. Her father, Ilham, previously meets his soon-to-be son-in-law, Putra, at his book launch event titled 100% Halal, Becoming Successful by Marrying Young. Portrayed as a devout and courageous young woman, Ninis is resolute in her decision to accept Putra's proposal, maintaining that it is important to adopt ta'aruf, Islam-compliant courtship, and avoid modern dating, and to marry as early as she can, as prescribed by his father, thereby avoid the dangers and temptations of dating and premarital sexual relations. Nonetheless, things go awry very quickly in the film, as following her marriage to Putra, Ninis discovers that Ilham may not be her rightful guardian, as he hides something about his past, including her real mother's identity. Afraid that she might be sinning due to an illegitimate wedding procedure, Ninis self-annuls her marriage to Putra. Without Ilham's knowing, she travels out of town to find her biological mother. Long story short, with clues left by her grandmother, Ninis discovers that she was born out of a wedlock to Rinda, Ilham's past girlfriend, whom he was in love with, but could not marry because Ilham's father was disapproving of her rural background and profession as a dancer. Upon this realization, Ninis is outraged. Together with Rinda, her biological mom, she confronts her father, during one of his seminars and disowns him in a sense. Following this plot twist, Ninis and Putra undergo a repeated marriage ceremony in the presence of her biological mother and rightful guardian. As such, echoing the film title, her marriage to Putra becomes 100% halal. Quite predictably, however, the film wraps the story with a happy ending, where it features a cathartic reunion of a father and daughter who eventually decide to let go of the past and move on, leaving the audience questioning about his responsibilities as a religious public figure who is not only dishonest in his profession, but also sent out wrong messages on marriage and influenced many youth through his book. Now, moving on to the larger context from which this film emerges, I wanted to highlight two important facts here. First is that although the visibility of Hijrah as a youth movement and popular cultural trend might only strongly be experienced today, it does not happen overnight. The idea has taken shape at least since the 1980s. And second is that films in which Islam emerges as a primary focus are by no means a new phenomenon in Indonesia, though the nature of its representation is always fluid and shifting. As elsewhere in the world, the Indonesian film industry is of a porous nature, exposed to various transnational political, cultural, and economic interventions. As such, throughout different historical periods, occurrences and of certain themes and narratives, including those of Islam, are deeply influenced by local and global dynamics. In recent times, one could argue that with the growing influence of popular discourse of Hijrah as a subtext, the representation of Islam and Muslims is largely shaped by heightened anxieties around modern transformation, and more specifically, the post-1998 neoliberal reforms and democratization. To set the context as to why Is this the case, and how we get there? I include here a brief overview of cinematic trends in the region, starting from post-independence until the post-reform periods. For the interest of time, I could not really cover the entire historical developments, but just to briefly put some notes about how Islam is represented in the past. It's always aligned with the development of the political regimes of each time. So for example, in the beginning, in the 90s, in the 1950s, so most of the films, especially national films that were produced that were supported by the state, addressed the Muslims collectively in relation to revolutionary ideals or anti-colonial solidarity. Now, in the 90s, there's a major shift in the way Islam is being represented, in the sense that it's drawn towards more addressing Muslims as atomized individuals. And this is coincides with the development of television in the 1990s. So, and just before that, the global religious revivalism has already influenced, especially the middle class Muslims in Indonesia, and they start to kind of like grow as in a way as a populist movement in opposition to the authoritarian regime. But then the boom of the Hijrah trend is really associated with the post-reforms era. So especially in the beginning, in the 2000s, the post-reform era is characterized generally by artistic experimentation as well. So it is characterized by new independent filmmakers who benefits from the newly liberated media environment. They're trying to offer narratives that were otherwise silenced during the authoritarian regime. And in a way, they're very experimental and relies more on the independent film production. But at the same time, during the height of media freedom, morality politics also heightens, with various conservative religious groups assert their dominance in the media and often engaged in fierce contests with the more liberal-minded groups. And during these times, there are a few Islamic themed films that actually focus on individual transformation, but it was not as popular as these days until 2008, where there was a very successful melodrama films based on a novel that becomes a blockbuster in Indonesia. And then following that success, a lot of films follow similar concerns with melodramatic themes. So it is in this climate associated with democratization and of course neoliberal reforms that follows, the Indonesian capitalism becomes increasingly more deregulated and privatized, that Islamic representation on films become more focused on the individual kind of like self-cultivation, aspirational piety, as one says. So these films that portray Hijrah-minded individuals correspond to the emergence of new work and individual ethics that neoliberalism entail, which translates into aspirational piety. So as the effects of neoliberalization are experienced to the greatest extent, it is argued that the terms of civic participation are increasingly conditioned by neoliberal productivity and Islamic cultural politics, which leads to the fusion of self-improvement and self-enterprise techniques with religious cultivations, or in the proper Foucauldian terms, is governmentality or technologies of the self. So against such a backdrop, led by new breed of preachers and religious influences, Hijrah-minded Muslims start to organize themselves and launch community groups and forums based on their renewed interest in pious lifestyles and Islam-compliant consumption, and encourage others to do so. As such, religious discourse become informalized and vernacularized by ordinary Muslims who may seem well-versed in Muslim affairs, but do not acquire proper formal religious trainings. The rising prominence of Hijrah is thus inseparable from the growing power of the new Muslim middle class, creating its own intellectual, political, and entrepreneurial elites, drawing on the increasing public visibility and commercial success. In this sense, as can be seen through figures such as Uje and Ilham in the films earlier, the Hijra discourse exists outside of the purview of traditional religious communities of discourse or authorities, and is grounded more in the entertainment and lifestyle industries, particularly those of self-help. In the global context, many scholars such as Hib, Gole, and Bayat conceptualize this development as a form of post-Islamism, in which Islamism is increasingly depoliticized following the age of deregulated capitalism and steadily infiltrating social and cultural everyday life practices. As such, in essence, the Hijrah lifestyle discourses, as with Islamism in general, carries the ideal of changing the society as a whole, of Islamization of all spheres of life, and thus can be thought of as a critical introduction of Muslim agency into the modern arenas of social life. Within such conditions, the preoccupations of Hijrah-minded Muslims in Indonesia penetrate the popular cultural trends. So in the popular cinema, it mainly explores in everyday themes that often project certain religious ideals around dating, marriage, and family. So added to that development, in Indonesia's popular media representation of Islam is a standardized and formulaic Islamic or religious film genre, gradually taking form in melodramas and targeted to a pre-established audience segment. Compared to earlier films, the genre mainly draws on individual desires and emphasizes outward observance of norms and Islamic piety. As such, piety becomes aspirational, deeply interwoven with specific visions of the good life, which normally involve fantasies of material success, individual fulfillment, and marriage life. Accordingly, the everyday life, homes, romance, and family become subject to intense scrutiny and certain standards of care. In this regard, the new Islamic films not only elicit modern Islamic subjects, but also dramatize a newly imagined Islamic life. Of a major concern today in the scholarship, in the current scholarship, is how this genre, specifically when it takes on themes such as sexuality, dating, and marriage, becomes a venue to advance conservative views that perpetuate gender conformity and subordination of women. As many feminist Muslim scholars in the region says, the anti-dating discourse is fraught with challenges coming from the conservative slant that seeks to domesticate women, justify discriminatory practices such as polygamy, and promote an unhealthy mindset around marriage, including the marrying young thesis in 100% halal, which reduces the purpose of marriage into avoiding sins. So, as a final note, I find the Hijrah trends and its popular culture expression provide crucial insights on the mutations of neoliberalism as technology of government or governmental practices in non-Western and non-secular settings. So melodramas become an important terrain to construct a new Islamic way of life and project a different form of modernity. As such, modern techniques of the self, which are set to produce self-aware, self-governing, self-reliant, and self-enterprising subject, interact with the religious tradition, and likewise, how religious tradition is being transformed or reshaped by such incorporations of modern structures and processes, such as melodrama elements that involve intense self-disclosure and self-exposure, and ultimately individualization. That would be the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Najra, for that fascinating talk, which I really enjoyed how you dived into a more contemporary instance, but gave us that wonderful timeline there to help us think through how it fits into the bigger picture of cinema in Indonesia. That's just absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. We are on schedule and perhaps even a bit ahead of schedule, but we'll keep moving ahead here. And I'm sure our next presenter will turn on his camera in just a second, but let me offer an introduction to our next speaker, who is Dr. Mohamed Ghawanmeh. Welcome. Dr. Ghawanmeh is a scholar and filmmaker who is currently serving as the executive director of the Philadelphia-based organization Al Bustan Seeds of Culture. Dr. Ghawanmeh earned his PhD from UCLA in 2020 in the Department of Cinema and Media Studies. His research, interests, and expertise fall in the intersecting fields of cinema, governmentality, migration, nativity, religion, theater, music, literature, industrialization, and modernity, typically in the mold of cultural history. His dissertation research is titled Flux, Egypt's Silent Cinema and its Transition to Synchronized Sound, 1896 to 1934. Dr. Khanme's talk today is titled School of Satan's Al-Azhar's Censure of Egyptian Cinema Coincides with the Vogue of Islamic History Films. So welcome, Dr. Khanme, and go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you to Dr. Heba Abdelfattah for inviting me to join you. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks to the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale University. My contribution to our gathering today is based on a paper that was published last year as part of an anthology called Muslims in the Movies, a global anthology edited by Christian Peterson and out as part of the Mizan series from Harvard University Press. This paper is principally a work of industrial film history. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, and we'll go from there. School of Satan. Al-Azhar's censure of Egyptian cinema coincides the vogue of Islamic history films. The relationship between the Egyptian state and the venerated millennium-old Institute of Cinema, of Sunni Islam, named Al-Azhar, has influenced Egyptian cinema over the decades, especially films whose content is deemed quote-unquote Islamic in subject or theme. In Majallat Al-Azhar, the namesake publication of the institution, authors commented on cinema repeatedly. Muslim scholars generally did not care for cinema or its social effects, and the magazine's content illustrates Al-Azhar's censure of Egyptian films over much of the last century. For example, a 1957 essay claims cinema corrupts moviegoers because it is a school of Satan. This chapter examines Al-Azhar's role in approving the roughly 15 or so films dealing with Islamic history, which belong to a production trend in Egypt that began in earnest with Dhuhur al-Islam. This is the emergence of Islam, directed by Ibrahim Azz-al-Din. Notice the iconography there, from 1951. And the vogue concluded with a film called Ash-Shayma, and that was directed by Hussam ad-Din Mustafa in 1972. So about 23 years. Overall, and here's an image of here's an image of Ash-Shayma. Overall, Al-Azhar's disavowal of Islam-centered film served as an extra-legal instrument of government censorship and as a public critique of the cinema. However, Al-Azhar's position on the depiction of Muhammad's contemporaries, this is the Prophet Muhammad's contemporaries, permitted visual storytelling that would have been impossible had Al-Azhar taken a more strident line, such as that of its contemporary Muslim Brotherhood. This essay references religious and cultural journals, variety magazines, and industry papers of the era to discuss the relationship between the Egyptian government's cinema censorship apparatus and Al-Azhar's participation in assessing film projects' propriety for production. It begins with a review of Al-Azhar's censorship function and tradition of censure in relation to the cinema and to the Egyptian government. Then it focuses on the allowance that Al-Azhar made for performing, that is portraying, most of Muhammad's companions, the Sahaba, in theater and cinema, arguing for how such allowance emboldened producers to embark on film projects Islamic in theme or subject. And then it concludes with an assessment of how Islamic history films negotiated industry trends, audience expectations, Al-Azhar's strictures, and the censor's eye in vying for success at the box office and beyond. Let me start, please, if I may, with Al-Azhar's function in censoring the Egyptian cinema. 2 film projects are documented to have been censored in Egypt on the grounds of religious insensitivity before the emergence of Islamic history films, both of which proposed to have an actor perform the Prophet Muhammad. Both Egyptian projects, rather one was a German project in Egypt that to be shot partly in Egypt. Both projects were aborted, having been assailed in the press. Both were proposed as foreign productions, but the first and far better remembered project involved one of Egypt's celebrities, theater director and actor Yusuf in the role of Muhammad. I'm really pleased that my paper here intersects with that of Heba's, and also relieved that despite all that you learned from the rigorous paper about the actor's work and life history, you did not quite learn that of his uncanny resemblance to Nicolas Cage. These projects predate a definite trend of Islamic films that begins 2 decades thereafter, but establishes Al-Azhar's position on depiction of hallowed persons, which is most significant to this study's analysis. Al-Azhar declared its stance in response to published news that Yusuf had signed in the German embassy a contract for the exorbitant amount of 10,000 Egyptian pounds to perform the role of the Prophet Muhammad. This position would be attenuated so as to allow for depiction of most companions of Muhammad. An allowance a few of the Islamic history films examined herein would certainly take advantage of. Egyptian state censorship of the cinema first affected its exhibitors in 1909. Thereafter, various ministries and supervisory bodies would take on the charge of overseeing exhibition houses and the films that they screened. Significant for this essay's purpose is that the censorship function was bifurcated by the Egyptian government in 1946, only a few years before the onset of the Islamic history films that I here discuss. This bifurcation was administrative. The Ministry of Social Affairs, Wizrat al-Shu'un al-Ijtima'iyya, oversaw issues of sensitivity toward common decency, family, and tradition, while the Ministry of the Interior, Wizrat al-Dakhiliyya, minded public safety and national interests. This segmentation is confirmed by Muhammad Ali Nasif and his successor, Mustafa Darwish, both having served as Director of Censorship within the Ministry of Social Guidance, established in 1952 in the wake of the Free Officers' Revolution, or coup, if you prefer. I probably would. During this study's period of interest, Nasif cites religion as the subject of films that pose the greatest threat to Egyptian society, following sex. Indeed, restrictions and requirements on representing religion, especially Islam, its practices and sanctities, appears in a censorship table produced by the Egyptian government in 1947. Darwish does correctly identify depiction of prophets as among the prohibitions, for it appears in this table. The table does not, however, mention Muhammad's companions, such as depicting them depicting them was not illegal, according to the censor's letter, including the venerated, rightly guided caliphs or khalifs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Although it had been written, the 1947 code had not been made public at the time of Darwish's first appointment as Director of Censorship in 1962, that's 15 years later, so as to shroud the censorship process in secrecy, he gathered. Notable is that the code's points of prohibition are particularly abstract in the religion segment. Of the 5 points delineated, 2 begin with, to take into consideration. Have a look at this text. Presentation, to take into consideration, presentation of ceremonies and rituals, especially those Islamic, in a dignified, respectable fashion, and to be considered as respect of religions and not opposing doctrines, while avoiding subjects and dialogues that propagate religious or national discord. Since the practice of taking a thing into consideration hardly directs the considerer to act in any way definitive, such points as above only further the censorship code's vagueness. Yet such ambiguity seemed well suited to Al-Azhar's being unofficially assigned the task of approving film projects with Islamic themes. Al-Azhar sanctioned films in a single stage of oversight, whereas the censorship office did so in at least 3, signifying Al-Azhar's authority relative to that of the censorship department. The Egyptian censor required 3 submissions before issuing approval for domestic exhibition. 2 of these occurred in pre-production. First, the producer would present a treatment of a screenplay to the censor to be accepted or rejected, in which case amendments were suggested. Having received a pass for the treatment, a producer would then submit a completed screenplay for a similar assessment. Once approval of the screenplay was secured, the completed film would be reviewed before granting a permit for domestic exhibition. The object of such a system is that a tiered approval process prevented unnecessary investments of time, energy, and funds into a commercial product that would not be sellable. In the years leading up to the study, the Egyptian censor had on multiple occasions denied an exhibition permit after reviewing the film, even though it had been made to the letter of an already approved screenplay. Indeed, Al-Azhar's approval of a film's idea or treatment at minimum was necessary for the censor's allowance to proceed with shooting an approved script of Islamic theme or subject. Al-Azhar reviewed screenplays as a matter of course, not merely treatments of the story. Although I could identify only 2 cases of film productions seeking approval directly from Al-Azhar, typically, productions hired historians and theologians not affiliated with Al-Azhar to advise on the religious content of films, including Muhammad al-Banna, son of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, and regular contributor to a journal with which the organization was identified, Liwa al-Islam. Al-Banna participated in 2 panel discussions on performing hallowed figures referenced in this essay, and consulted on the film Sayyid al-Badawi from 1954. Al-Azhar's oversight of cinema would not become official until 1985 for an exhibition of arts dealing with religion. Until then, Al-Azhar's oversight differed from picture to picture. During this operative era, Al-Azhar clearly functioned in a society not governed according to its interests or preferences, not least in the allowance for vice that Egyptians experienced. The cinema was one such a vice. If a pocket of virtue in the prurient morus, that is the cinema, could be passed by earnest Islamic-themed projects, then Al-Azhar was increasingly willing to proffer its approval and offer its counsel. They even sent representatives upon request to the action site for a meet and greet of the cast and crew of Fajr al-Islam, Dawn of Islam, that is, directed by Salah Abu Saif in 1971, and an on-set production consultant in the case of the multinational production that would follow the vogue of films herein examined, namely The Message, directed by Mustafa Al-Aqad from 1977. This is a film I do not consider as part of my study, but kind of an epilogue case. These 2 productions were among the most exorbitant among all Islamic history films, with Dawn of Islam costing 130,000 Egyptian pounds, and The Message's budget amounting to a whopping $12 million. So securing an Al-Azhar's sanction for their resulting film, not only for their source screenplay, was likely a precautionary measure, not least since both film stories are set in the Mecca of the Prophet. Depicting the Sahaba selectively, Al-Azhar's attenuated position, it is perhaps convenient to consider Al-Azhar a reactionary institution. They had for centuries acted as legitimators of regimes under which it had served and from which it had acquired funding. Yet Al-Azhar arguably took a risk in permitting the depiction of most of the Sahaba, a position that waxes relatively progressive. This position was expressed plainly in response to a query published in a regular feature of Al-Azhar magazine dedicated to issuing edicts, those are fatwas, in response to reader queries. In this case, one sent in from a member of the General Television Administration, إدارة التلفزيون العامة. The edict declares the personifying Sahaba in acting is permissible as long as the performer is of a character that would not sully the reputation of the companion depicted. The edict excludes from this allowance depicting, quote, Sahaba's greats, such as the rightly guided caliphs, as well as Ali's sons, Hassan and Hussein, and Muawiyah, founder of the Umayyad Empire, who were involved in the hostilities that bore Islamic sects. This exclusion has held in all of the films and Arabic language Islamic history productions for television that I have viewed, until that is, the production of a 2012 TV series, Umar, funded by the Qatari government in conjunction, surprisingly, with NBC, which is a Saudi government-owned media outfit. Even though the resulting show was criticized, condemned by the Mufti, that is the issuer of edicts, the Grand Imam, as it were, of Saudi Arabia, and was also denounced by Al-Azhar. But this is beyond the era of my study. According to Western film practices, it would seem regressive to discuss the propriety of depicting Muhammad, let alone his companions. We ought not ignore, however, that one of the two prohibitions applied by the British Board of Film Censorship at its creation in 1912 was the, quote, materialization of Christ, the other one being nudity. The film Emergence of Islam served to signal the marketability of historical and Islamic themed films. The film compelled Al-Azhar to attenuate its strident position on the depiction of the Sahaba because the film's director and screenwriter were particularly influential in the Egyptian government at the time of the film's release. Although neither had worked in the cinema prior, nor would they again. Producer-director Ibrahim Izzuddin had bought the rights to Taha Hussein's novel, The Divine Promise, Al-Wa'd al-Haq from 1949, upon which Emergence of Islam was based, under the condition that Hussein participate in writing the film's screenplay. With the forming of a new parliamentary government in 1950, a year before the film's release, Ibrahim Izzuddin's brother Muhammad Salah ad-Din was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Taha Hussein himself was appointed Minister of Education. The censor approved the project despite protests by personalities associated with Al-Azhar in the press. It seems that the solemnity of the story, the mannered earnestness of the film's performances and dialogue, the eloquence of the continual narration, something uncommon to this vogue of Islamic history films, the frequent use of still photography, and the highly deliberate pacing, along with the relative authority of the film's government-affiliated principles, not only overcame Al-Azhar's protests, but attenuated its stance on depicting the Sahaba permanently. Al-Azhar's edict, its official sanction of representing most of the Sahaba and all of the Tabi'een, this is the followers, arguably allayed anxieties that producers and funders might have felt in taking on Islamic history films whose characters could not be depicted, as it was only a dozen or so characters that couldn't be. Depicting the Sahaba photographically with limited expectations was rejected by other Islamic institutions and figures, most notably those associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, as demonstrated by two seminars conducted by their journal, Liwa al-Islam, Banner of Islam. This is the 5th issue from 1928. Panelists disagreed on the propriety and value of telling stories about early Islam in films. They not only voiced concern about how stories about a sensitive era of Islamic history were contained textually, but also about how such accounts were depicted, particularly who performed the roles of the Prophet Muhammad's companions. I have noted two trends in the collection of Egyptian films, Islamic history films related to casting. The first of these recalls the Obermargau. This is the passion play in Germany that's been occurring for centuries, in casting relative unknowns to perform hallowed female figures, so as to ensure public acceptance of female characters as performed. I'm happy to add to this, to elaborate on this point, but want to move on in the interest of time. And the other thing I noticed was the strategy of casting relative new, of repeat casting of actors. And that's something that I noticed extended beyond actors to directors and producers. For example, many of the actors, producers, writers, and directors on these 14 films worked on 3, 4, 5 projects. One of which was this one, Khalid bin Walid. One of the 24 or so panelists that participated in the 2 seminars earlier mentioned was Islamic scholar and author Ahmed al-Shirbisi, who had worked for Al-Azhar for nearly a decade. Al-Shirbisi may have believed that his involvement in filmmaking could produce works of culture to stand against the corrupted preponderance of the art industry's output, to demonstrate that the cinema could aspire to virtue with good faith and determination. Yet he equivocated so that a more conflicted relationship with the cinema manifested. Al-Shirbasi, likely did not think the cinema could be rectified, or he would not have penned an essay in Al-Azhar magazine condemning it and dubbing it a school of Satan. Contradictorily, Al-Shirbasi published his essay the year of the release, this essay, School of Satan, the release of Khalid bin Walid, this is this film, which is the first film for which he had consulted. In the piece, Al-Shirbasi lambastes the cinema for the prurient immoral content and for its venues, which prey upon the youth, literally luring them away from their schools by day to attend their screenings. Nor was Al-Shirbasi's piece the only one published in an Azhar magazine to criticize exhibitors. That said, the publication more commonly railed against the content of Egyptian films, including Islamic history films, whose depravity exemplified in 3 ubiquitous matters of content in films of the day: dancing, cabarets, and kissing. Such publicized scorn may seem incommensurate with Al-Azhar's charge of approving screenplays for filming, only that Al-Azhar would certainly not have missed that most of the Islamic history films in question contain one or more dance, kiss, or cabaret scene. Indeed, all but 3 that I studied, that's 12 films, but only 3, The Emergence of Islam, Khalid bin Walid, and Nasr Salahuddin, Saladin the Victorious by Yusuf Shaheen, only these 3 don't contain scenes of dance, usually of the more sexually suggestive variety and sometimes performed by scantily clad dancers. These dances are often performed in cabaret-like environs, dens, tents, and royal courts in which voracious men consume alcohol with female hostesses at their sides. When performed outdoors, attending men delimit the performance space by lining its periphery. Islamic history films smacked of prestige, which was a point of appeal for funders, producers, filmmakers, and stars who sought to work in them. Yet none seemed to replicate the success of their progenitor, Emergence of Islam. And even though such films had legs, that is, longer than most, especially in terms of revenues recouped from foreign sales to governments and distributors in majority Muslim countries, such proceeds took long to realize. Further, the generic link between such films and spectacle epics increasingly compelled producers to have to shoot them in color, which, though costly, proved vital for enhanced appeal, as evidenced by the relative success of the color film Rabia al-Adawiyya, that's this film, the almost identical film, Martyr of Divine Love, that's this film, which was in black and white, released the year prior. Indeed, it is unlikely that Saladin the Victorious, the most expensive Egyptian film to date, would have been made as a lavish epic in color had it not been co-produced by the state-owned Egyptian cinema organization. The operative vogue may well have ended the following year with the making of The Messenger's Hijrah in 1964, were it not for two films co-produced by the General Egyptian Cinema Organization in the early 1970s. Dawn of Islam was not only co-produced by the organization, and it was commonly dubbed, but was also made from an original screenplay written by the director of the organization. This is the Government Cinema Production Institute, Abdel Hamid As-Sahhar. Moreover, it was released in the year when news of the organization's corruption and incompetence began to appear in the press. Al-Shima, the final production in the vogue of Islamic history films I have discussed, was fittingly among the last crop of films that the organization produced, as it was liquidated in 1972. After that, cinema production in Egypt became private. A year after the Al-Azhar magazine had published a piece condemning the performing of a Sahaba, as if to signal a hardening of its religious positions soon to come, now that Anwar al-Sadat had succeeded Nasser as Egypt's president. The Message, a multinational production of an Islamic history spectacular, would follow in 1976, but Egyptian Islamic history production had firmly and successfully moved to TV at this point, state-owned and run, a medium whose inherent strictures, because of its broadcast service, suited the Islamic subjects and themes, a shift that is maintained to this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghawan May. It's interesting to see how many connections are already emerging here between the different papers. 3 so far, and we'll have 2 more after our short break now. So we'll turn to South Asia and Turkey and 2 remaining papers. And of course, there'll be a Q&A session as well. So just a reminder, you can put any questions you have in the Q&A box for the Q&A session. But with that, we're going to take a short break now. It's 3:20, so I think we'd like to start at 3:25. So it is indeed a very short break. We'll give you a chance to go grab a quick tea or coffee. We're going to leave the webinar running as it is, and everyone can stay logged on. And when we come back, our chair, Dr. Abdelfattah, will be chairing the next panel, which will start at 3:25. So we will see you back here in about 5 minutes.
All right. Thanks everyone for being here. Our next speaker, who is probably going to turn on her camera, and she's already sharing his screen, is Professor Angela Roy. Professor Roy is a professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Karanpur. She's the author of Memoirs and Post Memories of the Partition in India, published by Routledge in 2019, Imperialism and Sikh Migration, the Komagata Maru Incident. It's again published by Routledge in 2017. Cinema of Enchantment, Perso-Arabic Genealogies of the Hindi Masala Film, published by Black Swan in 2015, and Bhangra Moves from Lidwana to London and Beyond, published by Aldershot in 2010. She has edited Magic of Bollywood at Home and Abroad, published in 2012, and co-edited Travels of Bollywood Cinema from Bombay to Los Angeles in 2012. In addition, she has published a number of journal essays and book chapters on cinema and music. So without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Roy.
Thank you very much, Heba. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I really enjoyed listening to all the presentations, because there's not been much exchange between us in our parts of the world, whereas we get to see films from Hollywood and the West, but we don't get to see each other's films except in film festivals. So thank you so much. I learned so much. But today I'm going to talk about Qissa Laila Majnun and romance in Hindi cinema. Now, my problem comes from, my slides don't seem to be moving for some reason. Yeah. Okay. Now, the pioneering scholars in Hindi cinema, they've talked about the narrative of Hindi films to have been influenced by the Hindu epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and also identified an aesthetic, an indigenous aesthetic for Hindi cinema, drawing from Hindu religious or Hindu mystical traditions. So some of the, the narrative, visual, and also the cinematic economy of Hindi films seems to be shaped by what they say is Hindu, terms from Hindu philosophy, to name a few, dharma and darshan. Now, my problem with that was that from my understanding of what I saw from Hindi films, there is a Hindu, one cannot deny the influence of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the two main epics in Hindu Sanskritic epics. But there's also a parallel tradition, which in India we have two great traditions, it looks like. We have the Sanskritic Hindu tradition, but we also have an Islamic tradition, what we may call the great, the Perso-Arabic tradition, which runs parallel. And I felt that the storytelling is equally influenced by this tradition, mainly from the Dastan and Qisse. And this is something which we should pay attention to. So this is what I try to do in my book, Cinema of Enchantment. But today I will not talk about my book. I would just focus on this particular aspect because there isn't much time to talk about everything, all the influences that I have traced in my book. So when we look at the Perso-Arabic tradition, there is this, as I said, you can't deny the influence of Mahabharata and Ramayana, but at the same time, when you emphasize only the Sanskrit narrative and aesthetic traditions in the theorization of Indian cinema, this is being increasingly questioned. For instance, Philip Ludgendorff asked this question and wanted to know, is there an Indian way of filmmaking, and is there only a Hindu or Sanskritic base to it, or is there something more? So with that, I found that while acknowledging the contribution of the dominant Hindu Sanskritic narrative tradition to the shaping of popular Hindi cinema, the alternative narrative streams that have governed storytelling in Hindi films, particularly the Perso-Arabic legacy of the Qissa and Dastan, that has been erased or marginalized in the construction of national cinema, must be explained. Now, if you look at these, I cannot read the script, but we have some of the earlier, these were the Qissa and Dastan, which were in circulation. And what I understand is that the Qissa Dastan tradition has been being found in India from the north to the south as early as the 6th century AD, and tellings of the Qisse as early as the 7th century, followed by those produced from 1780 at the Fort William College in Kolkata. Now, I'm indebted to the work of Francis Pritchett, who talks about the genre of printed popular literature in Hindi and Urdu, and is disheartened to discover that the flourishing Qissa publishing business that she had documented in the 1970s was nearly extinct when she returned to India in the 90s. So her definition of Qissa as stories derived from both 1001 Nights and Katha Sarit Sagar, which locates them in the syncretic cultural space which Farina Mir has identified. So now when we look at Qissa Majnu Laila, it's Farina Mir who's traced a fascinating genealogy of the Qissa in Indian vernacular literatures to the Persian Qissa. Her argument is that the Qissa traveled from Persia to India, first to Punjab and then to the rest of North India. And they blended with the local Qissa traditions, and a new form of Qissa was born in India. And she gives an example of some of these Qissa. For instance, now what happens also here is that the meaning of the term Qissa itself changes when it travels, because when it's used in Islamic literature, it's used to refer to tales told by popular religious storytellers. Its meaning expanded to allude to tales of no religious character by Qassas, and the term Qissa came to mean story in general. Similarly, the Persian lineage of the term suggests biography, usually the biographies of religious figures or pseudo-biographies such as Hansa Nama, which was disengaged from religion by the end of the second millennium, to refer to stories in general and romance in particular. Now, she cites Amir Khusro's Majnu Laila, composed in the Masnavi form, as evidence of the incorporation of Qissa in the Persian literary culture of the 14th century. She shows that these romances were incorporated over the centuries into Indian vernacular oral and textual traditions. So if you look at these, I've got together the covers of some of the Qisse which were published, and these are some of the earliest books along with Hindu religious texts. These were some of the earliest publications when the printing press came to India. For instance, the Munshi Nawal Kishore Press in Lucknow. One of the earliest publications were the Qisse, and we have several editions, several publications of the Qissa Lailo Majnu. There was also a Hindi one which I showed earlier. So, what I'm trying to say is that Qisse were part of Indian imaginary for a long time, but they were already known to the Indian readers as well as to the Indian listeners. But how did they become part of how did they influence Hindi cinema? So it's not just cinema, but all literary forms, all literary cultural forms were influenced by the Qissa Dastan tradition, including novel. Now what happens is that with the collapse of the court of Oud, which was the center of learning and which was a center of Islamic learning as well as literary culture, when the British take over, after that, there's a whole lot of people who were patronized by the Nawab, and they find themselves without employment. Now, it is the Muslim invasion, if one can call it. It begins with the migration of Urdu poets and the wives of the courtesans, first to Parsi Theater and then to Hindi cinema. So they say that the history of Hindi cinema can be traced to Parsi Theater, which is a form of theater which developed in the middle of the 19th century. And the owners of Parsi Theater were Parsis who are believed to have come to India from Iran for a long time ago. But the language which was used in Parsi Theater was Urdu. So most of the writers, the musicians, the singers who were part of the Parsi Theater, they were the migrants from Lucknow or from the court of Oud. And that's what explains the not only the inclusion of the Qissa and the Dastan, because the Parsi Theater would often stage these Qisse or the Dastan from the Shahnameh and so on, but also because Urdu was the language. So it was the talent which came from out, which contributed to the Islamic culture of first of Parsi theater, and then we move on to the Hindi film. Now, there are two views in it, and some say that that when the Hindi film moved from the silent era to the sound, when it began to speak, there was a change in the themes from the devotionals and mythologicals, which were, Hindu-centered, or they were taken from Sanskrit epics. There was a change, and when this change took place, these changes were taken from Parsi theater. There was also inclusion of song and song and dance really comes from Parsi theater. So this Parsi theater drew on a rich repertoire of fantasy and historical romances from the Persian Shahnameh and Indo-Islamic romances, as well as Shakespeare and Hindu mythologies, tracing a link between the decline of the Parsi theater and the emergence of what she calls the Islamic film. Rationale ascribes the Muslim invasion of the film industry to the migration of talent from the Parsi theater to the Hindi film. Now, there's also parallel. What happens is what we have in Hindi cinema is what Mukul Keswan has called the Islamic culture. That needs to be, when looks at the Islamic culture of Bombay cinema, we have to distinguish it from the religious understanding of Islam, because in cinema, it becomes a kind of cultural construction, an Islamic cultural construction, which is identifiable not only in cinema, but also outside cinema. And so when you look at these films, there is a category of films called the Muslim socials. These Muslim socials which celebrate the Islamic culture, and I have some of these films here. That's where you see the transformation of the range of expressive idioms to the coming of sound, which Ira Bhaskar and Richard Allen believe led to the emergence of the Muslim social in the 1940s and its transformation into the dominant genre in the 1960s. So from here, we move to, while the mythological framework of the silent film demanded a Hindu iconography, sound returned it to the speech community of Urdu and the repressed Qissa Dastan tradition. The naturalization of Urdu as a register of romance in Hindi cinema has been attributed to the cross-border migration of Urdu poets to Bombay after the partition of 1947 and their co-option in the Hindi film industry as scriptwriters, lyricists, and directors. Pattaya locates the Urdu invasion of Hindi film at the end of the regime of the silent film and the birth of the talkies, arguing that the coming of sound to Indian cinema meant that Hindi cinema needed stars with the right accent. So as the first talkie, Alam Ara, which is 1931, demonstrates, when the Hindi film began to speak, it spoke not in Hindi, but in Urdu, which was not surprising in view of Urdu's dominance as the official language during the British Raj. However, it continued to speak in Urdu even after the propagation of a Sanskritized Hindi through the state-owned media such as All India Radio and Doordarshan and educational institutions. Due to the dominance of Urdu writers and poets in Bombay cinema, the Hindi film continues to serve as a syncretic space destroyed by the partitioning of the nation, in which Hindi and Urdu, Hindu and Muslim, are deeply implicated with one another. So after having given you a broad overview of why there is a dominant Islamic strain in Hindi cinema and what were the causes, what were the reasons for the strong presence of the Qisse Urdu language in Hindi cinema. Now let me come to the theme of romance itself, which is the topic of my talk today, or my presentation today. So let me talk about two kinds of love. And this is our eminent psychiatrist, Sudhir Kakkar, who's also a writer. He talks about two kinds of love. And he talks about the first kind of love is the kind of love which is Radha's love for Krishna, the Radha Krishna love, which is a Hindu Sanskritic, which comes from the Hindu god Krishna and his consort Radha. And he talks about a second kind of love, which is the love between Layla and Majnu. And he says that these are the two templates for love available, which are dominant in India. By Radha Krishna love, he feels that the love between the Radha and Krishna is the love for is the love which is of the here and now, whereas the love between Layla and Majnu is a love which is an essential desire of God. Earthly love is but a preparation for the heavenly acme, the challenge to rights of older and powerful men to dispose of and control female sexuality, the utter devotion of women lovers to the man unto death, loving in secrecy and concealment, yet without shame or guilt in the Majnu Layla tradition. So now we come to Majnu Layla. Now when we look at Radha Krishna, there is, one cannot deny the presence of Radha Krishna, the trope of Radha Krishna, which permeates or pervades Hindi cinema in various forms, in the songs, in a lot of images, in the dialogue. There is a presence of Radha and Krishna, which cannot be denied. There are a lot of motives, such as the motive of Vastraharan, where Krishna steals away the clothes of the gopis and Radha's friends. So this kind of love is part of religious worship. It's erotic and has an element of titillation. Layla Majnu, on the other hand, are, so this is the difference between the Radha Krishna love and the Layla Majnu love, because Layla Majnu love is seen as a kind of pak ishq. It's seen as a kind of pure love. This is Heidi Paulus, who says this. She maintains that Majnu Layla is a romance belonging to the, this is Ruqayya Yasmin Khan. She says that it's a tale of revealed love spun by a poet whose concern was supposedly not to reveal his love. She maintains that Majnu Layla is a romance belonging to the Udri corpus of love tales, known for their portrayals of ostensibly chaste and thwarted love affairs, in which a poet lover loses his beloved precisely because of impugning her chastity. Now, exploring the reasons for the transformation of the doomed lovers from social deviants to cultural icons, Catherine Hansen suggests that the predictable answer in Indo-Islamic scholarship would be to refer to the mystical allegory of earthly lovers as seekers of the divine. So not only Layla Majnu, but Shiri Farhad and He Ranja come out of the mystical tradition of Sufism, which identifies the lover with the seeker for eternal truth and beloved with God. However, the legend's spiritual Sufi dimension, in Hansen's view, was diluted in Nautanki Theater, in which it became the template for earthly love that appears to have been carried over in Hindi cinema. Now we come to the next part, which is So if we look at Ramayana, why do we one of the slides? Yeah. So why is it that the Hindi filmmakers chose the legend of Layla Majnu rather than Radha Krishna? It's because the filmic courtship has many echoes from the erotic Radha Krishna tradition. Yes, but at the same time, the Hindi filmmakers prefer the pak ishq. Now, similarly, when they talk about why is it that they prefer Layla Majnu? The reason for Hindi cinema's privileging of the Layla Majnu legend as a metaphor for pure or intense love is the strong eroticism of the Radha Krishna tale. While the hero might be seen performing the Ras Leela with his gopis in the song and dance sequences, the Radha Krishna legend cannot be adopted to translate the notion of pure love or pak ishq because the relationship of Radha, who's married to someone else, to Krishna, carries suggestions of illicitness. While the divine lovers are equally viewed as embodying the idea of devotion in bhakti mysticism, and Radha's relinquishing her dharma for the sake of love is elevated to the metaphysical level, the Radha Krishna love would not have met social approval at the level of lived experience. So this is why in Hindi cinema, Krishna Bhakti that stresses the aspect of eroticism might be given full play, but has to be finally reined in to the idea of Maryada or conventional morality. Now I come to the next point, which is again made by Sudhir Kakar. So we have also the template of the hero in Hindi cinema, and as opposed to Ashish Nandi, who talks about Devdas as one of the dominant figures, dominant templates, or the dominant models of the hero, male hero in Hindi cinema. Sudhir Kakar talks about the Majnu hero in Hindi cinema, and he feels that it's a Majnu hero which takes over not just. There seems to be a fusion of the Majnu hero, because we've had several versions of the Majnu hero over the years in Hindi cinema, because we have him as reincarnated. So on one hand, we have the model of Sharat Chandra Chatterjee's, the novelist, Bengali novelist Sharat Chandra Chatterjee's hero Devdas. Many of you might have seen the new version of the Devdas starring Shahrukh Khan. And on the other hand, we have the character of Majnu. Now, according to Iqbal Masood, who is a noted film scholar, the Majnu and the Devdas figure both merge into one in the figure, in the actor, in the star image of the actor Dilip Kumar or Yusuf Khan, because it is he who enacts both the roles. So in his film Mughal Azam, which is about Salim's undying love for Anarkali, and he's willing to give up his life for the sake of this slave girl, and also Devdas, who dies because of his unrequited love for his childhood beloved Paro. They seem to merge in the figure of Dilip Kumar. So the isomorphism of Islamic context of this legend, the Anarkali legend, with the Persian-Arabic Qissa, and the near perfect fit of Muslim actors with the legendary lovers produced an iconographic image through which Dilip Kumar, who played Salim in the film, came to represent the Majnu lover in addition to the hero, Devdas. So the meaning of the Majnu lover, Persian-Arabic, the meeting of the Persian-Arabic Majnu with the Bengali Devdas in the body of the Muslim actor foregrounds the blurring of the two heroes and the great traditions in the cinematic regime of the Hindi film through the actor's performance of multiple identities. And I won't go into the detail of the Dilip Kumar's biography that paralleled that of the characters he played, imprinted him in the Indian imaginary as the Majnu image. The Majnu hero of the Hindi film, as Kakar and Ross memorably named him, is indelibly etched on the body of the Muslim actor and reappears in various incarnations, Hindu and Muslim, time and again in Hindi cinema. I won't run into the history of all the other heroes who personify Majnu, but I can quickly talk about Shahrukh Khan, where in Shahrukh Khan films, you have the Majnu hero returning with a revenge. Now, if Majnu provides a template for the male protagonist, the male hero in the Hindi film, there's also the Layla heroine. When the people ask Majnu, why do you cry, Layla? Layla, why, when she's so dark-skinned? Majnu replied, oh friends, you do not perceive real beauty, for while the pages of the Quran you read are white, the words of the Quran are written in black ink, a black that's as lovely as my Layla. So if Majnu provides a template for the hero of Hindu films, the object of his desire is clothed in the garb of Layla. The Laila heroine of the Hindi film serves as the antithesis of Radha. Unlike the fair Radha of Hindi love poetry, Laila, whose name means light, is dusky in complexion and the site of forbidden desire. Though the love poetry in the Bhakti tradition is no less erotic than Sufi, the articulation of sensual desire in the film, targeted at a family audience, turns to the Muslim beloved whose racialized blackness serves as the perfect site for the voicing of repressed desires forbidden by the Dharmic law. Although the sensual imagery of Sufi verse represents a spiritual belonging in a manner similar to that of Bhakti poetry, the Hindi film polarizes the Sufi and Bhakti into languages of desire and worship, respectively. So when we look at the Muslim Layla, the dark-skinned Layla in whose darkness the Sufi poet sought to dissolve himself, becomes an object of male desire in the Hindi film. Although the Layla in Hindi cinema is not necessarily dusky, she is made to serve as the object of the Hindu male's desire. The fetishization of the Muslim female as Layla in the Hindi film is partially due to the historical positioning of the actress in Hindi cinema, contradicting the discourse of wailing through which the female Muslim subject is projected as conservative in Indian society. Her Parda Nashin veiled countenance intensifies her desirability in the Hindu male's imaginary, whose gaze, averted in the Hindu female's presence, travels to explore intimate zones to enact forbidden fantasies. Now, I'll conclude by talking about how the idea of love itself, the way love is expressed, and the codes of love are shaped by the Udri codes of love. And I will focus on three aspects of the Udri code, which recur in the dialogues and the song lyrics of Hindi cinema, and the whole code with which the hero quotes his beloved, and the conventions which govern their relationship. So Ruqayya Yasmin Khan mentions the juxtaposition of the tongue that conceals and the eyes that reveal in Arabic literature, and lists various traits associated with love, holding the tongue, denial by the lover if he is interrogated, and feigning a show of perseverance, out of which two are directly due to the tongue's concealment. Now, this is an etiquette that regulates Hindi cinematic romance from Mahal to Love Ajkal. In Mahal, the beloved begs her lover not to reveal their love to the world by repeating Majnu's indiscreet acts of chanting Lala's name and drawing her image on the walls. If you could hear the song, it would have a different resonance, but I translated it. I would be able to keep the secret. How would you control your heart? Not only in your heart, but you paint my picture on walls. Don't do this. Don't let me lose my good name. Now, this is something which is repeated in a more recent film, Veer Zara, which is love across the border between a Pakistani Muslim woman and a Sikh Hindu male, Veer and Zara. And in this film, you have the cross-border love, where in Veer Pratap Singh, the Hindu hero of the film, prefers solitary confinement in a Pakistani jail to betraying his Muslim beloved Zara. This is invoked in the award-winning lyrics of the Urdu poet Javed Akhtar, where he says, I have lived with my lips sealed for you. I have lived swallowing every tear for you. Even so, the lamps of my love for you keep burning in my heart, only for you. So now today, when you have no direct renderings of Laila Majnu, though there was one last year, but in all the films, you have the etiquette, the code, which governs the behavior of the lovers. Like Veer follows Ibn Hazm's love treatise to the letter by holding his tongue, explaining this whole code of honor to the new generation. Jay, Veer in Love Ajkal, another film, explains how he stopped following his beloved to her college because she begged him not to let people cast aspersions on her good name. So one of the traits of love is holding the tongue. The lover will deny everything if interrogated. Now, the second part of the Qudri Code is that even though the lover is bound to seal his tongue, he's also provided the license to reveal it in the form of a poem, illustrating the coexistence of secrecy and revealing. So, pointing to this connection between poetry and courtship in early Arab culture, Khan holds that pre-Islamic codes love produced is suggestive of a model of masculinity in which men cultivated the art of composing and publicly reciting poems and odes praising women. So Majnun is described as the most homely, elegant, and brilliant in the poetry of the Bedouins and is believed to have sung Laila's praises. If you look at the songs and dances in Hindi film, particularly the ghazal, you have the Matru lover who does not express his love directly for his beloved, but he sings her praises in the ghazals. So it's a kind of veiled expression of love. If ghazal was the mode of inserting the qissa until the 80s, in Bollywood, which is the post, corporatization Hindi cinema, Bollywood is also shows a Sufi invasion with imitations of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's Qawwalis and Sufyana Kalam by reinserting the qissa into Hindi film. So I'm quickly going to stop with this. These are films which have no relationship with qissa and Laila Majnun, but through the Sufi songs, because these are written by well-known Urdu poets, you have the Sufi idiom of love making a surprising entry even in the contemporary westernized middle-class milieu of the Mahesh Bhatt films, through the recurrent and imagery of ashki in songs. The young viewers of Bhatt's films repeat and dance to songs like Ashik Banaya Apne or Ek Baraja Jhalak Dikhla Ja. The Sufi strains of the song Ya Ali Rahem Ali in the film Gangster are due to its being plagiarized from the same song in Arabic by Gitara, and Kaho in Murder did not conceal its plagiarizing of Arab music by retaining the original stanza from the 2000 hit Tamali Maat, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, performed by the Egyptian heartthrob Amr Diab. But it's the title song of Bhatt's Bo Lamhe, whose haunting melody pointedly articulates the grief of the love-lorn Majnun at the loss of his beloved. So with this, I'll conclude. It's my last slide. Sorry, there's one before, which is about dying, Fattah, to become dissolved, destroyed in love. And we have a Hindi film by the same name, where a lover dies for the sake of his beloved. So I conclude by saying that if the Hindu Bhakti tradition has formed one strand in formulating the idiom of romantic love in Hindi cinema, the Sufi concept of ashiki, of which Majnu Laila is the prime example, forms another. The conflict in the Hindi film is produced by the gap between the dharmic principle outlined by Vijay Mishra with those of ashiki, as the Hindu ethic of self-restraint in the observation of dharma is disturbed by the excessive desire of ashiki. The young lovers must ultimately submit to the higher authority of law. The Majnu Laila Kissa is a story of obsessive love that must meet a tragic end because it challenges the dharmic law represented by the father. The Hindi film, therefore, demonstrates the tension between the obsessive love expressed by young lovers and call of duty that ends with either the death of the lovers or their submission to the law, irrespective of the end that the desire must lead. Its seductive power not only over the actors, but also the viewers cannot be denied. Even as the spectator is seduced by the power of the images and the melodies to live and die by love, remind us about the call of duty to a barren family society interrupt the pleasure of union. The disruption of the dharmic principle to the hyperbolic language of ashiki in the Hindi film shows the deep implication of the Islamic in the Hindi. Thank you very much.
Thanks so very much, Professor Roy, for this fascinating and rich presentation. I now move to our next speaker. Chidem Slankard. I hope she is now getting ready to turn on her camera and share her slides. Professor Slankard is an assistant professor of film, television, and interactive media at Cleveland State University. In 2002, she received the Masters of Fine Arts in Filmmaking from Ohio University. She has written and directed several short films and video projects which have been included in exhibition and film festivals, including the Istanbul International Short Film Festival in Turkey, the Ohio Short Film and Video Showcase of the Wexner Center, Columbus, Ohio, the annual International Video Art Festival in Milan, Italy, and Exhibition 280, a national juried exhibition hosted in the Huntington Museum of Art in West Virginia. She has written and directed several film and video projects, including Breaking Bad, 2020, Pretty Vacant, 2020, and Dreamhood in 2020, Fresh Start in 2017, and Cultivation in 2016. Her work has been included in several exhibitions and film festivals around the world. Dr. Slankard's documentary work specifically focuses on migration stories, such as the portrait of refugee farming community in New Hampshire, a neighborhood revitalization story through the refugee resettlement in Cleveland, Ohio, and a virtual reality documentary exploring the multifaceted stories of refugee communities who have recently arrived in the United States breaking bread.
Thank you, Dr. Abdelfattah, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me and see my slide okay?
Yes, I can hear you and we can see your slide. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will go ahead and start. So my presentation is it's titled Third Person Plural, Turkish Class Divide Dramatized in Ethos. Ethos is a Turkish drama streaming television series, which was written and directed by Berkun Oya. The show was released on Netflix in 2020, and it depicts the lives of a diverse group of characters through intersecting stories against the backdrop of intense social polarization and class divide in contemporary Turkey. Through a character-driven approach, the miniseries examines the contradictions and anxieties which afflict the modern Turkish society, with a specific focus on the division between the pious and the secular. Ethos is a compelling drama produced with excellent production values and an artful directorial vision, patiently weaving its narrative for an international audience. The Turkish title for the series is Bir Başkadır, which means one of a kind in Turkish. And this title alludes to a popular Turkish song from the 1970s called Memleketim, which means my homeland. As a nationalistic love letter to a country after the second coup d'etat in the republic's young history, the song was meant to soothe a divided nation by acknowledging and celebrating its unique demographic composition. This title, Bir Başkadır, is translated into English as ethos, which refers to the characteristic spirit of a culture as manifest in its beliefs and values, which I believe is a subtle nod from the production towards its intention to capture the complex tapestry of modern Turkish society. Upon its release, Ethos found an enthusiastic audience and received numerous critical reviews, both in the Turkish press and internationally. The miniseries stands out in the mainstream Turkish television context, mostly known for its crowd-pleasing soap opera-like productions. Instead of the common escapist approach, Ethos approaches the subject directly, not afraid to start difficult conversations or ask challenging questions. In fact, the collective suppression of difficult topics is one of the main themes of the show. One reviewer states, director Berkun Oya's Ethos took the Turkish nation locked down in their houses by storm, as endless conversations were had about the representation of several social classes. He managed to put us on the analyst's divan, breaking through our defenses with his hypnotic cinematography. Another reviewer agrees, quote, widely hailed as the best Turkish series in years, it's hard to think of a more socially compelling Netflix original, unquote. Some of the common elements in more critical reviews revolved around the careful selection of representational characters in a contrived manner. One of the problems with the series is that every character seems to be representational, like a chess piece on a directorial board, ready to do the writer's bidding, with all of them suffering from some reason. Indeed, shows that kick up a stir often do so for touching a sensitive social nerve, for depicting who we are, rather than who we pretend to be, whether as individuals or as society, says another reviewer from The Guardian. Ethos introduces its main character, Mariam, who's played by Öykü Karayel, as she seeks help from a therapist. Piri is the therapist's name. So we meet them during their first therapy session. Mariam has been suffering from fainting spells with no apparent physical cause determined. Her doctor has recommended that she seeks help from a therapist, which is how she found herself sitting across from Piri. Their conversation is awkward, with Mariam not knowing what to do or how to go about speaking to a therapist. This scene sets the stage for one of the major themes of the series, which revolves around suppression of emotions and avoiding difficult conversations collectively. Most characters we meet in Ethos are afflicted with a systemic suppression, perhaps arising from the decades-long clash of traditional and progressive ideologies in the country. Mariam, on the left, is a pious young woman who wears a headscarf, lives with her brother's family, and works as a house cleaner. Her values are established by a patriarchal family structure, her conservative community, and her religion. Piri is the antithesis of Mariam, a well-off, educated, professional woman who feels alienated in her own country. Her independence is coupled with an intense loneliness, which she finds difficult to express and cope with. This loneliness and longing for a connection is about the only thing these two women have in common. Soon after Mariam's therapy session with Piri, we see that Piri also sees a therapist, Gülbin, who we see on the screen currently. Most therapy sequences are covered in single medium close-ups, like the image that we see in this slide, with each character positioned in the center of the frame. This framing visually boxes the character in and isolates them from those around them. In one of their sessions, Piri talks about how challenging it is for her to connect with Mariam. We can see Piri struggle with her own prejudices, trying to overcome them as she feels compelled to help Mariam. She shares with Gülbin that when she was growing up, her mother perceived women who wore headscarves as monsters. She seems to resent this judgmental generalization, yet still struggles to connect with Mariam. She tells Gülbin, "I went to Peru last year, the other side of the world. Even among people whose language I don't understand, I felt more at home." Piri is lonely and nearly suffocating in a society from which she feels alienated. Her lonely and her struggle and frustration mostly fester inside her. She laments how hard it is to keep everything inside. If only I could say all the things I wanted to say, all the things I think and feel. Of course, Piri is not alone in her struggle. Gülbin, so this is the therapist, right? Gülbin comes from a divided and somewhat dysfunctional Kurdish family. Her sister is a devout Muslim who wears a headscarf. The two women do not see eye to eye and are in constant conflict, mostly stemming from issues around identity and value systems. Gülbin has rejected the traditional and religious family culture and followed a westernized path, including her higher education, her professional career, and independent lifestyle. Gülbin's sister resents her for doing so, mostly because she feels that Gülbin looks down on her own family. The lack of communication and connection between the two sisters is so severe and their frustration so great that the two succumb to a terrible fistfight, which is rather difficult to watch. In Ethos, the narrative unfolds primarily through conversations between characters as they inhabit their ordinary environments, as opposed to significant events or actions. At times, the show feels slow, but never boring. We're compelled to look at these fictional lives almost in a meditative way, not rushing through, but mindfully observing each detail as they emerge. For instance, Maryam and those around her all remove their shoes when they enter their homes and wear house slippers, a common tradition in Turkey. This detail is depicted in numerous scenes, functioning as a traditional marker for Maryam and her family. It also serves as a source of humor in some scenes, especially when we meet Hilmi, a young man who is enamored by Maryam, who appears to have a hole in his sock, and he kind of curls his toes to hide the hole. Maryam's discourse includes many religious phrases that are part of everyday Turkish life, such as "May Allah bless you," or "May Allah never leave us without you," which sets her apart from Piri. Her religion is an important part of her life and family culture. Her family has a close relationship with a local cleric who live in the same neighborhood. They seek his guidance on most matters, including Maryam's therapy, about which he is ambivalent. When Maryam mentions the cleric, Piri, Maryam's therapist, judges her, assuming she blindly follows all advice the cleric doles out. Soon after the scene, we realize that Maryam keeps seeing Piri despite the cleric's ambivalence and does not tell him that she is doing so. It also becomes evident that Maryam, who is hardly a gullible simpleton, as Piri first assumed, was not blindly following anyone's advice, including that of the cleric and her therapist. One of the biggest plot elements revolves around Maryam's brother, Yasin, and his wife, Ruhiye. Yasin works as a bouncer at a bar, and Ruhiye stays home, afflicted with a deep depression. We later learned that Ruhiye is a sexual assault survivor suffering from PTSD. She visits her hometown, a small village in Anatolia, with the hope of finding some closure and solace, which she indeed does when she learns that Yasin, her husband, has severely beaten the man who had assaulted her years ago. This man, her attacker, leads a disgraced life, ostracized by his community, and walks with a limp, an injury he sustained during the beating. It's a strange plot element which somehow satisfies Ruhiye's desire for justice. Yet whatever form of justice this may be, it was delivered by Yasin in a violent act. Ruhiye, however, does not seem bothered by the fact that her husband is capable of such violence and seems relieved because there has been some consequence for her attacker. She recovers from her bout of depression and reconnects with her husband upon her return to Istanbul. And this is an image of her as she's in her village and her recovered sort of connection with her husband upon her return. Most characters in Ethos are shown watching television at night at some point in the story, specifically a crowd pleaser Turkish drama featuring Melisa. Melisa is essentially the actress of this show within Ethos. Melisa is a popular actress, mostly appearing in a lowbrow soap opera-like television shows. She and Piri meet each other at a yoga class and become friends. Melisa often refers to her show disparagingly, even though it has brought her success and fame. In one conversation, she says, "It's a crowd pleaser for the masses." Piri agrees. "It's not like I'm going to watch a Turkish TV show all the way through." But she ultimately does indeed do that. And this is an interesting reference to the contemporary Turkish television industry with its significant international sales and global viewership, second only to the United States in worldwide television distribution, finding huge audiences in Russia, China, Korea, and Latin America. Mostly comprised of historical dramas or convoluted love stories, these shows tend to be escapist, plot-driven, which are often likened to soap operas. Ethos is aware of this larger context of Turkish television industry, and through this meta-reference, it at once acknowledges its dominant existence and attempts to change it. The interconnected stories depicted in Ethos present a panoramic dramatization of modern Turkish society. Some of the themes in the show such as the division between the pious and the secular, would be cliché if the show did not relay the complexity of Turkish socioeconomic structure. In a deeply polarized environment, Maryam serves as a conduit, connecting seemingly disparate characters to one another. Her transportation between different domains is visualized quite literally as she takes the bus from her neighborhood in the outskirts of the city, resembling a rural village more so than an urban center. As she travels, the small houses and greenery are replaced with concrete and glass structures of the city. She knows the bus schedule by heart, and she knows the city like the back of her hand. Ethos acknowledges that Maryam is an essential part of Istanbul's tapestry. She is not a transplant, and she is not an outsider, a common depiction in Turkish television of those who migrated to urban centers from rural Anatolia. Ethos accepts, reveals, and reflects on the complex demographic composition of Istanbul. It encourages its audience to do so as well. What does it mean to be from Turkey? Just as Maryam finds herself in a therapy session, forced to address her suppressed desires and fears, the show tempts its audience to do so as well. Giving voice to suppressed fears and desires, opening up and finding the courage to start difficult conversations is one of the most significant themes of Ethos. After 8 episodes and multiple therapy sessions, Maryam indeed finds relief. She also develops a sincere romantic relationship with Hilmi, who is a charming character with his sometimes awkward demeanor, as well as his deeply compassionate and optimistic outlook. Hilmi is very interested in Carl Jung and brings up his theories around the shadow self often. He tells Maryam that each person needs to find their purpose in life and not suppress their emotions. Maryam listens to him, though she does not seem as enthusiastic about Jung as Hilmi is. Later in therapy, Puri echoes Hilmi's sentiment. She tells Maryam that what we repress will eventually come out and manifest in one way or another. She shares an old Turkish saying, which is, "The water will find its crack." Maryam finally understands that her fainting spells had something to do with her repressed desires and worries around romance and marriage. She has indeed opened up and faced what she avoided for so long. She also got engaged to Hilmi in a later, one of the latest episodes. So there's a saying in Turkish, it goes, "Darısı başımıza," which is said on happy occasions, which means, "May your turn come next." It's a phrase shared when one has some good fortune, echoing a notion of community and wishing the best for all. Indeed, I will say, "Darısı başımıza." Thank you for listening.
Thank you so very much, Shadam, for this fascinating presentation. So I guess we have 10 minutes left for questions, and I have so many questions for all of you, but I'll just give the priority to our guests. We have a question for Dr. Roy, and it's an enlightening webinar, and special thanks to the organizer. I have 2 questions for Angela Giroy. So, do you think any similarities and clashes between qissas and their adaptation in cinematic representation? And the other question is, what's the rationale behind using the term Urdu invasion in one of the slides? You could see these questions written in the Q&A.
Okay. Thanks. I think I'll answer the second one first, because that's a term which I would use with quotation, within quotes. I wouldn't really call it an invasion, but I used it because it was, in the larger context, it was used in a particular sense that how is it that suddenly we switch from mythologicals and devotionals to Muslim socials, and how the whole, themes and also the style of Hindi films changes. So I was trying to show that because there was no employment for Muslim poets, musicians, Urdu poets, sorry, because the poets who wrote in Urdu were not just Muslims, they were also Hindu. or the tawaifs or the musicians who were employed in the court of Awadh, and from all parts of India, including after partition when Punjabis migrated to the Bombay film industry. You can't forget that most Punjabis are more familiar with Urdu rather than with Hindi. You know, they received their education in Urdu. So there was, it was felt that suddenly, like today, people are talking about the Punjabification of the film industry, that there's a Punjabi invasion. And there was a feeling that suddenly Urdu is taken over and it's invaded. But what I was trying to say, it was not used in a pejorative sense. I was trying to say that Urdu is the language of Hindi cinema. It's not just, it's not invasion, it is the language of Hindi cinema. It is the zuban of Hindi cinema. That's the second question to the second answer, second question. And the first question, I think it's a very difficult question. Now, in the adaptations of the Qisse, first of all, we have some direct filming of the Qisse. For instance, you have several of the Laila Majnu films, 5 or 6 produced since the silent era, 1922, the first one, you know, which I put in the cover, and the one which we chose was in 1951. And I am more familiar with the 76 version because, you know, I'm part of that Bobby generation. So Rishi Kapoor is my idea of Majnu. Yeah, but you have direct adaptations. But like Heba's just typed in the chat box, when you look at the adaptations in cinema, they're not direct adaptations. They are tailored to the context. So if it's you know, contemporary context, the tropes are the same, the themes are the same, even the plot is the same, but it's adapted to the contemporary context. So how Laila Majnu's story becomes a story of Veer Zara who come from enemy countries, or how it can be woven into a Bengali narrative like Devdas. So that's how I see the adaptation in cinema, not only in cinema but also in fiction. When you adapt a kissa, say you take Devki Nandan Khatri's novel Chandrakanta, which is supposed to be an adaptation of the Qisse, right? There's already a change because the genre itself makes a difference. So when you're moving from the oral storytelling of the Qisse is essentially meant to be told orally, it's not meant to be written down. So when you turn it into a novel, I mean, that was the allegation against Devki Nandan Khatri, the novelist who adapted Qisse, was that his novel was not a novel, it was just like a dastan or a kissa. So the genre itself introduces some constraints. I would say that in filming the Qisse, I think the visual element becomes dominant and probably it enriches it. And these are some of the answers that came to me offhand. But you've got me thinking, I should think about that.
Thanks so very much. So I have many questions, so I'll just say my questions to all presenters and then we can take turn answering. So I have a question for Najwa, and particularly with regard to the in the movie 100% Halal, there is lots of emphasis on the relationship between ritual and dance in what we can describe as pre-Islamic Indonesia. And I wonder, what is the place of these performances in the Hijra discourse broadly in the sociocultural context and in the film itself? The other question I had for Muhannad, I was so very much impressed by some of the data you were presenting, especially with regard to films like Sayyid al-Badawi and how these films are actually being censored by the Muslim Brotherhood, while actually the topic itself is a story and a biography of a Sufi saint. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the production of these films and the funding. You mentioned that it's being controlled by the Egyptian Institute of Cinema, Muassasat al-Cinema. But if you could talk a little bit about their funding generally, what's the major source of funding As for Sidam, I was very much impressed by your presentation of the character, the actress. What's her name? Melissa, who is doing double acting almost in the scene in the film. And what is her function in the series? And it's an array of fascinating, diverse female characters in this series, which I can't think of any other series that has all this. So if you could comment a little bit about that, I'd be grateful. Thank you. So we can start with Najwa, and then Muhannad, and then Shidam.
Thank you so much for the question, Heba. Yes, I didn't manage to discuss that part, the profession of the real mother of Ninis as a dancer. In particular, she's also a dance teacher in the village that she stays. So the name of the dance is Jaipong. It's from West Java. I myself is not very familiar with the dance, but if I were to refer to how the film constructs the dance through the female character. So when Ninis went to the village to see and find the mother, she was disguising as a field trip study kind of student or so. So she offered herself to actually become one of the students, but then out of her skepticism in a way, looking at how Ninis appears as a devout Muslim who's wearing a headscarf and with other friends as well, she mentioned something that is very key. I think if we connect it to the larger context of culture in Indonesia in the contemporary context, she said to Ninis that you're not supposed to learn this dance because this is quite erotic in a way. But then Ninis actually refuses, insists on doing the dance with her, and eventually they do dance together. I didn't show the picture, it was in the last image. So actually the Hijrah movement itself, if we put it into the larger context, most of the young people are very much open to artistic pursuits, including those that uses modern instruments. So there are so many vocal groups, including Muslim women, and sometimes they use modern instruments to actually sing and in a way make a very like minimum movements in a way. So in that regard, the Hijrah movement also very versatile in terms of their creative pursuit, including music and in a way engaging in certain forms of minimum dancing in a way. But there's this very key moment in Indonesian post-reform politics where actually one of the very key Muslim singer, popular figures, he is actually, so her music genre is, his music genre is called dangdut. Dangdut is a traditional Indonesian music. He was criticizing another dangdut singer who is a female and with some kind of a very erotic dance for the lack of the better word. And it was huge in the media, like this polemic between the two different singers, male and female, one with a conservative Islamic outlook and the other one, she's also a Muslim, but in a way practice differently. So because of the dance, actually, it becomes a very long debate as to how women body should be represented in Indonesian media, popular media. And it becomes a prelude to the anti-pornography and anti-porno action law. So I hope that dimension helps to clarify. So I think the 100% halal kind of like touch upon that kind of issue, because dance becomes that dance of that female singer called Inul Daratista becomes very iconic and becomes very an important moment for both feminist movement and conservative groups to actually advance their views. So I think it hints to that point as well. But then Ninis, the main character, actually tried to reform the narrative by joining the dance altogether. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. Next, Mohanna.
Forgive me, I was attending to my 5-year-old and I missed the question.
So I was asking about the Sayyid al-Badawi. I was very impressed by your mention of the film Sayyid al-Badawi, which is fascinatingly a Sufi saint biography, right? And then you also mentioned that it was the ones who were on the censorship board for that were affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. I think you mentioned Muhammad al-Banna. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the politics of this censorship of this film, if it was censored, and pertaining to other films also, what is the source of, where's the main source of funding coming from for these films?
Sure. The Sayyid al-Badawi was not censored. It was one of the 15 films of within this vogue of Islamic history films that I've identified that were released between the years 1949 and 1972. As for Muhammad al-Banna, participated in, wrote for Liwa al-Islam. This is the kind of the publication of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Wrote for the publication of the organization established by his father, and presented at 2 panel discussions that were source of sort of information about what Islamic scholars of the time in Egypt thought about the cinema and what their opinions about how it could be harnessed, if at all, were being generated. He, like others, it seemed, equivocated in the sense that he criticized the cinema openly and publicly, but was also willing to be hired as a consultant for Islamic history film projects, which typically did not seek, and I'm not sure why, did not seek. Only on two occasions did I notice cases of film productions seeking the sort of religious council, the historical religious council of Al-Azhar scholars. As for the productions, well, prior to 1961, they would have been private companies, the largest of which would have been Studio Misr. Studio Misr, it was not a government entity, but had strong affiliations with the Egyptian government. And then there was a 10-year experiment of so-called nationalization of the cinema industry in its 3 legs: production, distribution, and exhibition. So the period I discussed goes from 1949 to 1972. Some of the productions would have been private, by private enterprise, and some would have been state productions. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so very much. Chidam?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So there are a total of 7 sort of remarkable female characters in the series. Of course, the first one is Mariam, the main character. I believe the character that you were referring to is the actress, right? The actress who's in the series. It's very interesting, I think, because traditionally in Turkish cinema, depiction of the public has been almost in 2 categories: urban versus rural. So urban representing more Western values. You know, women may not be wearing headscarves, or they might have they might be professionals as opposed to, you know, staying at home or work in rural settings. And ethos, of course, acknowledges that that division is no longer valid, not that it ever was really, but so we see these characters connect with one another, and they are very different one another. They seem disparate at first, and then once they establish the connections, like the connection between Mariam and Piri, we see that they actually have a lot more common. with one another than they do. Melissa, the character who's the actress, is funny because she's sort of living the high life in Istanbul in this show. She's money, she's famous. And she befriends, Peri, the therapist, and they're in yoga class together. They're going to bars, going out. But she also, it sounds like the character Melissa has an easier time connecting and understanding other female characters than the therapist does. And in fact, she ends up helping her, giving her advice. And at some point, Peri acknowledges that, thank you so much for that. That really helped me. So the show does many things, I think. It's a very reflexive show, in my opinion. It looks at contemporary Turkish society and comments on it, which is a dangerous place to go because it is a work of fiction. It's not a documentary. On the other hand, it acknowledges the fact that it is indeed commenting on the society. And some of these issues, the division, the class division, and other divisions within the Turkish society, they're very difficult to talk about. They're not as well expressed. And people really, if you look at like modern life in Turkey, all the gated communities, people, you keep to your neighborhood, I keep to my neighborhood kind of a setting. So this show in that regard was quite remarkable because everyone watched it and everyone had a take on it. In fact, one thing that I'll share before, as I conclude my remarks, is so my sister who lives in Istanbul, who lives, a pretty charmed life, if you ask me. So when they decided to watch the show, my brother-in-law said, but it is kind of showing you the other, from the other neighborhood, like and so my sister's like, oh, that's fine. And so she watched the project and she watched the series and we discussed it. So the point being, it is indeed the show managed to connect disparate, connect this divided segments of society through series, at least to some degree. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for all these great answers. And I don't think we have any other questions. So I thank you all for your patience and dedication. And I thank for our guests for their attention. And thank you all for being here.